Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Localist Podcast, the show where we question if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and Milky Way Midnight fanboy Blunchley. In today's episode, we take all the stuff we learned about the scope of local authority in the last episode and talk about why it's not the full story. Okay, let's briefly go over what we learned on the previous episode. Last time, we started by talking about the relationship between the states and the American federal government. It turned out that the political concept, or kind of the legitimating principle behind how the federal government exists, is that it's a delegation of the states. The states supposedly represented the inherent sovereignty of the state citizens, the people. So, via the states, the people got together and made a conscious decision to delegate some of their inherent power to a higher authority that would govern, in theory, for the good of all. All of the power the federal government has is just a delegation of power that would ordinarily adhere to the states because the states represent powers that ordinarily would adhere to the people. That's why we have the 10th Amendment, which acknowledges that the United States powers are, quote, delegated to the federal government, and that those powers not delegated remain with the people. So you might think that the states themselves work the same. So, like your home state came around because all the people and the various towns and cities and counties came together and decided, let's delegate some powers to the state government for the good of us all. You might even think that the states have their own mini versions of the 10th Amendment, in that any powers that aren't delegated to the state government remain with the people and the local governments. But it turns out that's not the case. Instead, it's the complete opposite. Local governments and the communities within them have no inherent power at all. They exist only because the state government hands them down power from on high, creates them by passing charters or other laws. So even though your local government is the closest to you and the most in tune with your community, and has to care the most about you because there's less people that are voting in elections, it can't do anything on its own, and it has to go through the state legislature. This effectively means that the mass of state residents living outside your community have more power to decide what the law should be in your community than the people who, like you, actually live there. The reason this system exists is because of this old case from the 1800s about a railroad company trying to build a railroad through a town in Iowa. This case said basically what I just described. Local governments have no inherent authority, exist only as extensions of state governments, and can have their authority limited in any way that the state government wants. In fact, the case even said that a state legislature could pass a law that got rid of all of the state's local governments, and that the local government would have no ability to protect their own existence if such a thing happened. The judge who decided this case was named John Dillon, and he later wrote a treatise about local governments called Municipal Corporations. In this treatise, Dillon restated the holding from his Iowa case in the form of a rule. The local governments only have the powers the state government explicitly delegates to them via charter. If you want to know whether a local government can do something, you could look at its charter, and if it isn't explicitly mentioned there as a form of permissible authority, or there's not some other rule that the state legislature have passed, independent of the charter, that broadly says, oh, local governments in our state can do this, then it probably can't. Since this rule was set out in Dillon's case and Dillon's treatise, it became known as the Dillon Rule. The federal Supreme Court put the stamp of approval on the Dillon Rule in the 1900s, and now the Dillon Rule is how local authority works in the vast majority of American states. The vast majority, but not all. There's another system called Home Rule that works in a kind of different way. Technically, Home Rule is just a catch-all term that refers to several different state law schemes that give local governments more agency. But those schemes have some similarities that make them possible to talk about together. Basically, Home Rule states usually work something like this. The state constitution will identify certain areas where it is assumed that local governments have inherent authority. In those areas, local governments can act without the state legislature needing to pass a charter or a law or whatever first. The home rule areas generally, but not always, are those that are highly local in nature, things like setting salaries for local government employees or managing property owned by the city or county. So Dillon Rule, local governments get only those powers that are specifically handed to them in a charter. If there's no law saying that a local government can do something, then it can't do it. In contrast, home rule lets local governments have these state constitutionally granted powers in areas where they can act without needing pre-authorization from the legislature. They just get to act in those areas from the beginning. Let's use Ohio as an example. Article 18, Section 3 of the Ohio State Constitution says that, quote, municipalities shall have authority to exercise all powers of local self-government and to adopt and enforce within their limits such local police, sanitary, and other similar regulations as are not in conflict with general laws. Putting aside that conflict with general laws thing for a moment, this means that a municipality in Ohio could inherently do stuff like handle hiring for its police department or pass laws about sanitation requirements for restaurants, without needing the state legislature to add those areas of authority to the municipality's charter. Oregon's state constitution puts an interesting additional element into this home rule mix. As we will discuss, while home rule usually gives local governments areas of more or less inherent authority, they still usually don't get to exist without some action by the state legislature. The state legislature still has a pass that becomes the local government's charter. It's just that once the charter is in place and the local government has been born by that enactment, a home rule local government will still automatically have power in certain areas, even if those powers aren't provided in the state legislature passed charter. Oregon's state constitution goes one step further. I'm going to directly quote from Article 11, Section 2 of the Oregon State Constitution, which says, "The Legislative Assembly shall not enact, amend, or repeal any charter or act of incorporation for any municipality, city, or town. The legal voters of every city and town are hereby granted power to enact and amend their municipal charter, subject to the Constitution and criminal laws of the state of Oregon." This is really interesting. You might notice that this state constitutional provision doesn't actually provide municipalities any particular areas of inherent authority. Instead, it lets the legal voters of a given municipality pass their own charter. And because the voters have the authority to pass their own charter, they have the authority to decide what powers the charter conveys to the local government. Basically, Oregon voters get to say what their municipalities can and can't do. And the Oregon Constitution even specifically bars the overarching state government, the state legislature, from overriding that say, unless it conflicts with state law. Again, more on this later. So if the voters of a city get together and decide to amend the city's charter to give the authority to, say, require that new housing developments have to have a certain percentage of affordable units, then they can do that. And the local legislature can't just step in and amend the charter to get rid of that authority. This is in contrast to a Dillon rule state, where the state legislature would have to pass a law specifically granting that authority to do stuff in the area of housing to the municipality, meaning the state politicians from every other part of the state would have a say in whether the municipality got to add this affordable unit requirement as an extension of the local government's authority. Now, when I said previously that most states are Dillon rule states, or that there are certain states that are home rule states that aren't Dillon rule states, I was actually kind of oversimplifying things. The reality is a bit more complicated. While the Dillon rule is the norm, there are some states that use a combination of both Dillon rule and home rule. This would work by having the state constitution give local governments home rule authority in certain limited areas, and outside of those areas, local governments can still only exercise powers given to them by the state legislature passing a law. Another way this might work is by having multiple classifications of local governments aside from just county or city. For example, a state might designate some municipalities as villages and others as cities and give home rule only to cities. So in a sense, it's actually not doing you a really good service to suggest that there are some states that are Dillon rule states and some states are home rule states, because very often a state will have some mix of Dillon rule and home rule that it is used to set the outer boundaries of local authority. Or it might apply home rule or Dillon rule in a way that, yeah, sure, it technically falls into one of those categories, but has some characteristics that makes Dillon rule a little more like home rule or home rule a little more like Dillon rule. But, that said, there are a few, not many, but a few, states in America where home rule is featured very prominently and in fact used largely in place of the Dillon rule. These include Iowa, Florida, Oregon, Ohio, New Jersey, and West Virginia. Some other states are kind of home rule states, but have some other stuff going on that makes them Dillon rule adjacent or otherwise not perfectly fit into the mold of, I guess you could call it like a pure home rule state. These home rule-ish states include Alaska, Massachusetts, Wisconsin, and Utah. A couple observations about that list of home rule states. First, home rule states don't really fall along our usual modern day Democrat versus Republican or liberal versus conservative political borders. It's a pretty even split between solid blue and solid red states. I think this shows that local authority isn't really a Democrat or Republican issue. It's about your views on more fundamental ideas surrounding politics. These basic thoughts and opinions that occupy a completely different axis than all the federal stuff we normally spend a bunch of time fighting over. Second, it's really funny that Iowa, the state that gave birth to the Dillon rule, is one of the states that's opted for home rule. Voters ratified changes to the state constitution in 1968 and 1978 that gave home rule to cities and counties. This is much later than most other home rule provisions were added into other state constitutions. The big push towards home rule generally happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. What would Judge Dillon think if he could have known that his ruling would set out the scope of local authority for most of America, but not for his home state of Iowa? It's kind of an ironic outcome. Okay, so this sounds great, right? Home rule seems to treat local governments and the people within them as capable of making their own decisions about important problems in their communities. It looks like it provides exactly that local agency that the Dillon rule fails to provide. And the Dillon rule itself is premised on the idea that such agency can't definitionally exist. But here's the thing about home rule. Even though it might seem at a glance like it says, oh, local government, you get inherent authority in these certain areas and you can act in those areas without outside interference, that's not really what it does. In even the strongest home rule states, all home rule means is that local governments can possess certain powers without an express grant by the state legislature. But home rule usually, not always, but usually doesn't stop the states from just passing statewide laws that override local laws. Yep, that's right. Even in home rule states, state preemption of local laws usually still works the same. Here's how that works, featuring a fun topic that is often the punching bag of local versus state government conflicts. Let's say there's a home rule state where the state constitution gives local governments home rule authority for zoning. Zoning is just a set of local laws about where different kinds of things can be built, what kind of buildings can be in particular neighborhoods. This is stuff like buildings in residential neighborhoods can only be X stories high, or factories can't be built next to apartment buildings and have to be built in industrial areas. Anyway, so the local government has home rule authority over zoning. It exercises that authority by passing a new zoning law that says if you want to build market rate housing, 10% of the units have to be set aside for affordable housing if you're building your apartment in a high-density residential zone. Local government's charter doesn't specifically say, yes, you can put in affordable unit requirements as a part of zoning stuff, but it's fine, because under home rule, the local government just has the inherent authority to handle zoning stuff, even if the state legislature didn't specifically give them that authority in the municipal charter. But then, it turns out some big housing companies and developers aren't so big on this idea. They'd like to build lots of luxury apartments without any affordable units set aside. They could make more money if all the units in a building were really expensive instead of just 90% of them. So, they go to the state legislature and they lobby them to pass a law that says local governments can't require developers to add affordable units to a new building. This state law preempts the local law, even though the default under home rule is that the local government can regulate in this area. Once the state legislature passes a rule about it, that default goes away, and the state legislature's choice controls. And this is, most of the time, a perfectly acceptable, consistent, correct result under home rule. Usually, while home rule removes the need for local governments to have an explicit grant of authority before taking action, home rule leaves the principle of state preemption undisturbed. That's because while home rule gives localities more power and flexibility and ability to act on their own than the Dillon rule, it's still based on the same principle as the Dillon rule, which is that local governments have no inherent authority other than what they're given by the state, either by state law or by the state constitution. This might seem strange. Didn't I just spend a bunch of time explaining how home rule lets localities act without needing the state legislature to hand them down some crumbs of power? But it actually makes sense when you realize that home rule doesn't arise from a key recognition, which is that people in a local government have inherent authority. Home rule's source isn't popular sovereignty. It isn't a recognition that the people living in a community should be the ones to govern what happens there. It's still state-level authority that grants home rule. Whether or not a state is a home rule state is usually determined by the state constitution. There's some section or amendment or whatever that sets on home rule. Sometimes it's not even the Constitution. It's just a law that the state legislature passes that says from now on we're a home rule state. Home rule really isn't something fundamental that arises from the bottom. It's something artificial that's handed down from on high. In other words, home rule and the Dillon rule are both consistent with the principle that Judge Dillon laid out all those decades ago, which is that local governments are subordinate to state governments, and state governments can abridge local power in any way. The rules just express that same basic principle in two different ways. And that principle, the principle of local communities having no inherent authority, no inherent say in what happens in their backyard, is exactly the principle that I think is unfair and wrong. Home rule is better than the Dillon rule because it does let local governments have a little more room to breathe. But better than is absolutely not the same thing as inherently good. Let me explain and compare Dillon rule and home rule using a kind of melodramatic metaphor. In this metaphor, local governments are rats in a lab. The state government is the scientist. The Dillon rule rat's cage is just a huge maze. By setting down the walls of the maze, the scientist gets to completely control where the rat goes, what route the rat takes to get from point A to point B, and the kinds of things the rat gets to do. In contrast, the home rule rat's cage is only mostly a maze. While the outside borders of the cage are blocked off by maze walls, federal laws, state constitutions, state laws, etc., the area in the center of the cage is totally empty. The home rule rat can run around in the center space and do whatever it thinks is best. But at any time, if the scientist gets annoyed that the rat is in a certain part of this empty space, or starts using a part of the empty space to do something the scientist doesn't like, it can set down traps or maze walls to block that area off. The scientist can fill this empty space with as many walls as it wants, at any time, for any reason. Eventually, the home rule rat's cage ends up looking not all that different from the home rule rat's cage. Big old maze. Except maybe the home rule rat's cage still has one or two empty spaces the scientist hasn't gotten around to filling yet. Sure, the home rule rat still has it better than the Dillon rule rat. The home rule rat at least got to start out with its own space in its cage, and some of that space may still even be there now. But that doesn't change the fact that both the home rule and Dillon rule rats are in a cage. The scientist put them there, and the scientist gets to decide if they stay in the cages and what they get to do in there. The rats don't get to choose for themselves where they want to live, or what they want their surroundings to look like, or the things that they would like to spend their days doing. Now, once again, I have to say that the broad strokes I'm painting here aren't necessarily true. Some states look at home rule a different way. Don't look at it as, okay, home rule gives this set of powers that local governments automatically start out with, but that can be taken away at any time. These other home rule states instead view home rule as providing authority over core areas where the state legislature just can't intrude at all. In these states, these select few subjects are areas where the local government can legislate, and those actions cannot be overridden by the state or the state legislature. That means that if you're passing a law in one of those core areas, the state legislature can't just pass a law that preempts it. You might even say that in these kinds of home rule states, local governments have inherent authority over certain subjects. Ooh, inherent authority. Isn't that a fun, dangerous phrase? Aside from when we were talking about states delegating powers to the federal government at the nation's founding, we haven't really mentioned inherent authority or found a place in American law that recognizes inherent authority, have we? So cool. There are a few states that have home rule, and of those few states, there are an even fewer number of states where home rule actually provides local governments inherent authority over certain matters. Great, right? The governments that are closest and most responsive to average people have the power to actually address those people's problems. Popular sovereignty actually means something, no need to run the gamut of state-level politics, get things done in your own backyard, yada, 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 as long as what you're trying to do falls into the area of these certain matters. This is like a teeny tiny minority of American states, but hey, at least things are arranged rationally in some places in America, right? Just one little question. What are these certain matters? What are these areas where local governments are provided inherent authority? Well, that's the trick. The certain matters are matters of local concern. What's a matter of local concern? Good question, and one that doesn't always have a very clear answer. The way this term matter of local concern came about was to serve as an opposite to a matter of statewide concern. The theory, in these minority of formal states that give local governments some inherent authority, is that such authority is warranted solely for things that fall within the particular ambit, competency, focus of local government. An uncharitable description is that the home rule in these minority of states provides inherent authority over those things that are too minor and too in the weeds for the state legislature to bother with. We're talking truly local things like when trash needs to get picked up or where to put in stop signs, stuff like that. In contrast, local governments don't get inherent authority over stuff that touches on the people of the state as a whole, or that are a little more interesting and important and headline items that the state legislature is willing to spend its time to handle. This might be something like statewide educational requirements or procedures for state elections. Local government gets inherent authority on local things. The state keeps its overriding authority on state-level stuff. And because the state keeps its overriding authority on matters of statewide concern, if a local government tries to legislate in those areas, they can still get preempted. This little sphere of inherent power only extends as far as matters of local concern. Maybe you agree this is a reasonable way to have things set up. Maybe you don't. In theory, it's at least a clear and straightforward way to assign authority to the different levels of government. But here are the problems with this local concern versus statewide concern border, at least from this podcast localist perspective. The first problem is that in practice, it is super difficult to draw clear lines between what counts as a primarily local matter and what is a primarily statewide matter. And that mushiness is such that it becomes very easy to argue that practically everything has statewide consequences. Let's look at a case from Wisconsin as an example of how statewide concern can end up getting defined so broadly that really there isn't much room left for things that are matters of local concern. In some senses, this case is not a fair example. It's a super extreme instance of matters of statewide concern kind of swallowing up matters of local concern, but I still think it's relevant to talk about because it shows how what seems like a clear border can fall away pretty quickly in favor of giving the state level government more power. Okay, so Article 11, Section 3.1 of the Wisconsin State Constitution says that local governments may, quote, determine their local affairs and government, subject only to the Constitution and to such enactments of the legislature of statewide concern, there's that term, statewide concern, as with uniformity shall affect every city or every village. Sound familiar? This basically just says, home rule for local stuff, state legislature gets primacy for statewide stuff. Way back in 1938, Milwaukee enacts an ordinance requiring that city employees reside in the city. Now maybe that's a good idea, maybe it's not. It's obviously helpful for people who work in a city to live in it and be close to their jobs and have a stake in the community they serve. But it could also be true that the salary for a public employee makes it pretty difficult to find expensive city housing, or that the city would be able to recruit more easily if it didn't have to tell people who worked for it that they had to live in the city. In any event, whether or not this was a good restriction isn't really the point. At some time in the 2010s, I think maybe 2013, I'm not super up to date on Wisconsin laws, so it may have been passed at a different time. 2013 is the date that I found. The Wisconsin state legislature enacts a law that says local governments can't adopt or enforce residency requirements for local government jobs. Okay, sure. After this law gets adopted, the police and firefighter associations for emergency personnel in Milwaukee sue the city, seeking a declaratory judgment that after the state legislature passed this law, Milwaukee could no longer enforce its residency requirement for city jobs. Basically, they're arguing that under Article 11, Section 3.1 of the Wisconsin State Constitution, residency requirements for local government jobs are a matter of statewide concern, not a matter of local concern. And if they're a matter of statewide concern, then the state legislature's 2010s law saying no residency requirements should win out, should preempt over the 1938 local law that says if you work in Milwaukee, you need to live in Milwaukee. Black v. City of Milwaukee, which is what this case is called, makes its way up to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, and it gets decided in 2016. Now, if you're like me, hopefully you're not, hopefully you spend time outside touching grass and talking to women instead of recording solo podcasts, but if you're like me, you might look at this case and go, this is an easy win for the city. What could possibly be a more local concern than the qualifications of a local government for the jobs that it hires people into? It's literally just the city saying, here's the conditions someone needs to meet if they want to work for us. So it's a matter of local concern, right? And the local residency requirement ordinance isn't preempted because it's protected by Article 11 of the state constitution. Like, how much more local can you get than here's what people who want to work in jobs in the local government need to do? But, nope. The state Supreme Court said that the police and firefighter associations win, and the local residency requirement ordinance was preempted by the state legislature's ban on residency requirements, notwithstanding Article 11 of the Wisconsin state constitution. Why? Well, it turns out that Wisconsin uses this super weird standard to evaluate whether something violates home rule, which is really just another way of asking whether or not something is legislating on a matter of statewide concern or a matter of local concern. The standard is super strange and counterintuitive to me. It's a two-part standard. First, the Wisconsin court asks whether a law concerns a local or statewide matter. If it concerns a statewide matter, then the inquiry ends. The state legislature has the ability to legislate in that area and preempt any local government laws that deal with that statewide concern. But the law instead concerns a local affair, or it's kind of a mixed bag because the issue is part local level and part statewide. Then the state court will proceed to the second step, which asks if the state statute uniformly affects every city or village in Wisconsin. And as long as the state legislature's law is uniform in the regard that it affects every local government in Wisconsin, like isn't targeted at just cities or just a couple counties here and towns there or whatever, then it preempts contrary local laws, even if the state legislature's law is clearly about local stuff. I guess maybe the theory is that if a law evenly affects all local governments in a state, then it's a law about a quote-unquote statewide rather than local concern because it applies across the whole state. If that seems to make absolutely no sense and be actively contrary to the plain language of Wisconsin state constitution, well, I agree, and so did the dissent, but that's the standard Wisconsin uses. And in Black v. City of Milwaukee, the Wisconsin Supreme Court pointed to the fact that the state legislature's ban on local residency requirements was uniformly applied across the entire state, and because it was uniformly applied, it was a matter of statewide concern and it wasn't protected by the Milwaukee Constitution, meaning that the state legislature could preempt a local ordinance saying you have to live in a city to work in that city, and as a result, the Milwaukee ordinance saying you have to be a resident of the city to work for us was preempted. As this case shows, the amount of stuff in a home rule state that is a, quote, matter of local concern can be vanishingly small. To my knowledge, not all or even any other states necessarily use Wisconsin's same weird two-step standard that basically says if a state law is uniform, then it's a matter of statewide concern. But in an awful lot of home rule states that still use this local concern versus statewide concern division, the state legislature will still have de facto control over things that look an awfully lot like local matters, usually due to twisting the words of a constitutional amendment or clever maneuvering in the courts. You know, all the kinds of political gamesmanship that ordinary people like you and me aren't in a position to do. So that's the first problem, which is that in practice, the border between statewide matters and local matters gets drawn more and more so that everything becomes a statewide matter and doesn't leave a lot of room for local governments in home rule states to have inherent authority over local matters. The second problem is that even assuming that this border between statewide stuff and local stuff was very clear, and the state legislature properly respected that border and didn't try to slowly swallow everything up, leaving no room for local matters that local government still had inherent authority over, does that dividing principle of we'll give local governments inherent authority over local things and the state government gets to have overriding authority on everything else, does that even really make sense as a way to draw the boundary of local government authority? Sure, it might make sense in that it categorizes things neatly, but is it actually a rational and just way to say this is how much authorities local government should have. Let's just go back to some basic principles. Legitimate government is government that is responsive and accountable to the governed. Effective government is government that gives the governed an avenue to address the important problems they confront in their community. In America, there are multiple levels of government. There's local government, state, and federal. And of those three, it's the local governments that are the most responsive, accountable, and immediate to everyday people, and have to care the most about their votes. Now, most responsive and accountable does not mean actually responsive and accountable, just comparatively more so. And there are serious problems with the ways local governments operate and how that elevates some voices while silencing others. We're going to talk in future episodes about some ways those problems might be addressed. But that doesn't change the fact that of the various levels, local, state, and federal, local governments are still the most responsive. And since they are the most responsive and reachable, they are arguably the most legitimate of the American levels of government. But despite having the highest level of legitimacy, they have the lowest level of effectiveness. Why? Because they don't have the authority to take on serious problems in their constituents' communities. And importance doesn't respect the little local concern, state concern boxes that home rule tries to sort things into. That's just not the relevant spectrum. The real question should be, what are the things happening on the ground in our community that are the most impactful and most pressing? And how much power are we, the people who live in our community, given to take on those things via our closest form of government, the government that has to chase after our votes, that we can go and sit in meetings on any given weekend, that lives in the community that is close to us, that has to listen to us. In sum, the Dillon rule gives local governments basically no inherent authority. And home rule gives maybe a little bit of inherent authority in some areas, and it is better than the Dillon rule. But it still doesn't solve the basic issue. Under either the Dillon rule or the home rule, local governments have the least amount of power to tackle problems in their backyard, and instead it's the less responsive, less immediate, less grounded, and less knowledgeable state and federal legislatures who paradoxically have the most say on how things should be handled in your community. And those are really the only two models of local authority that exist in America today. It's either home rule, Dillon rule, some combination thereof. That's not really encouraging, is it? But it wasn't always a foregone conclusion that things would end this way. There was one point in history, one very small point in the midst of these late 1800 and early 1900 questionings of what local government should look like, where someone stepped forward with a different vision on the nature of local authority. Next time, we talk about the principle for local authority that never was, the Cooley Doctrine. We'll go into what the Cooley Doctrine is, why it has fundamental differences from home rule and the Dillon rule, and how it points in the direction of a more just grant of authority for local governments, while still falling a little bit short, arguably because it fails to take its premises to their logical conclusion. If that sounds interesting, think about following the show on Spotify, or shoot me a question at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localistpod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin MacLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.